You are sitting somewhere quiet right now. And in about 4 seconds, something in your skull is going to do the exact thing it did last night while you were asleep. You won't feel it happen. There's no sensation attached to it at all. And here's the part that shouldn't be possible. A full 8 hours of sleep last night did not stop yesterday's memories from fading right now, while you're sitting here awake, doing nothing in particular. Sleep was supposed to have handled that already. It didn't finish the job. The real fix isn't something you do at night at all. It's a specific kind of doing nothing, in the afternoon, that most people spend their whole lives accidentally avoiding. And once you understand what's actually happening in that gap, you'll never look at a quiet 10 minutes the same way again. Here's the fact underneath that. Your brain replays yesterday's experiences again, compressed 20 times faster than they happened, in tiny bursts called sharp wave ripples fired from a seahorse-shaped structure called the hippocampus. That's the mechanism that turns something you experienced once into something you actually remember. For decades, the story was that this only happened at night, during the deepest stage of non-REM sleep, when the cortex and hippocampus talk to each other in a rhythm nobody consciously controls. That story is incomplete. The same bursts have been recorded in people who are wide awake, sitting still, eyes closed, doing nothing at all. Not napping, not meditating in any formal sense, just resting, undistracted for a few minutes in the middle of the day. A neuropsychologist named Michaela Dewar ran a study at Heriot-Watt University with a group of patients who had severe amnesia, the kind where new memories don't stick at all. She had them listen to short stories, then sent one group into 10 minutes of quiet, wakeful rest in a dark room, and sent another group straight into a distracting task. The resting group remembered dramatically more. Patients whose hippocampus was too damaged to form new long-term memories under normal conditions were still in that resting window, laying something down. If quiet rest can pull memory out of a brain that medicine considers incapable of forming it, that is not a small effect. That is a door left open that almost nobody walks through. So why would 10 minutes of sitting still outperform hours of trying to actively remember something? Because active recall and passive replay are not the same operation, and they're not even run by the same part of the system. Trying to remember something on purpose recruits the prefrontal cortex. Think of it as the brain's supervisor, the part that directs attention and holds a goal in mind. Replay runs underneath that supervision, in the hippocampus, and it runs best when the supervisor steps out of the room. Which raises the harder question, what exactly does the supervisor do every single afternoon that keeps stepping back into that room before replay can finish its work? It checks a phone, it opens an email, it answers a question someone just asked from across a desk. Each of those is a tiny act of directed attention, and directed attention is precisely what shuts the replay process down. This is not a willpower story. Nobody is failing at rest through laziness. The average adult, according to a 2015 analysis of workplace interruption logs from the University of California, Irvine, is pulled off an uninterrupted task roughly every 11 minutes during the working day. 10 minutes of true, undirected quiet, the kind Dewar's patients got in a dark room with nothing to do, has become one of the rarest states a modern nervous system ever enters. That same 2015 analysis found the average worker checked some form of communication, email, messaging, a phone screen, over 70 times across an 8-hour day, which works out to roughly once every 7 minutes once lunch and meetings are subtracted out. 7 minutes is shorter than the window Dewar's patients were given. The room, in a modern working day, essentially never empties on its own. Think about a library at closing time. The books that were pulled off the shelves during the day don't reshelve themselves while someone is still browsing the stacks. A librarian needs the room empty to do that work efficiently. Your hippocampus is the librarian, and yesterday's experiences are the books scattered across the reading room. Every time you check a screen, you've let another patron back into the library, and the librarian has to stop reshelving and go supervise them instead. The reshelving isn't canceled. It's just perpetually interrupted, one browser at a time, all afternoon. There's a second layer to the mechanism worth naming precisely, because the terminology matters here and glossing over it would be dishonest. The hippocampus doesn't just fire on its own. It talks to the cortex through a structure called the thalamus in a rhythm called a sleep spindle, a burst of oscillation roughly 12 to 14 times a second that acts like a gate opening between short-term storage and long-term storage. During deep sleep, spindles and sharp wave ripples are locked together in a tight rhythm, almost like two departments handing a file back and forth on a fixed schedule. During waking rest, that same handoff has been detected in a looser, slower form, still real, still measurable on an EEG, just without the same rigid timing. Naming that difference matters because it explains why nobody serious claims the daytime version is a full replacement. It's the same handoff running on a rhythm nobody has fully mapped yet outside a sleep lab. Which raises a question worth sitting with before moving on. If the daytime version is real but weaker, why does it matter enough to build an entire video around it? Because weaker and frequent can outperform strong and rare. The same way a slow drip fills a bucket faster than an occasional downpour that mostly runs off the sides. A person gets one sleep cycle a night. A person can get 4 or 5 genuine wakeful rest windows across a single day, assuming the room ever actually empties. The nighttime mechanism is deeper. The daytime mechanism is available far more often to a nervous system that past a certain point in life isn't getting the deep version as reliably as it used to. There's a name for the network that lights up when the supervisor genuinely leaves the room, the default mode network, a set of brain regions including the hippocampus and the medial prefrontal cortex that becomes more active, not less, when you stop directing your attention outward. It was first mapped in detail by Marcus Raichle's group at Washington University in the early 2000s, and it was a strange finding at the time because the assumption going in was that an idle brain should look quiet on a scan. It didn't. It looked busier than a brain given a task. The default mode network isn't a rest state in the sense of powering down. It's a rest state in the sense of a factory switching from customer orders to inventory. Nothing external is being produced. Everything internal is being sorted. Some sleep researchers push back on how much weight to put on wakeful replay, and they have a real point. Sharp wave ripples during actual slow wave sleep are denser, longer, and appear to consolidate a broader range of memory types than the daytime version does. Nobody credible is arguing that 10 minutes on a park bench replaces 8 hours of sleep architecture. What the wakeful version appears to do is something narrower and in its own way more useful for daily life. It catches the specific experiences from the last few hours while they're still fresh enough to be caught, rather than leaving all of them queued up for a night's sleep that, especially past a certain age, isn't running the same consolidation program it used to. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly. Slow wave sleep, the deep dreamless stage where the biggest share of nighttime replay happens, declines measurably with age. A study out of UC Berkeley led by Bryce, Mander, and Matthew Walker used detailed sleep recordings and memory testing across a wide adult age range and found that the amount of slow wave sleep a person gets predicts how well they consolidate new information overnight, and that this stage of sleep specifically, not sleep in general, thins out earlier and more sharply than the rest of the sleep cycle. Total time asleep might barely change. The deep stage inside it, the one actually doing the heaviest replay work, shrinks first, which means the nighttime tool that used to catch everything is catching less than it once did, for reasons that have nothing to do with effort or discipline. That's the two threads running through this, and they run in parallel every single day of your life without you noticing either one. Thread 1. At night, sharp wave ripples fire during slow wave sleep, consolidating memory in a process that depends on a sleep stage that thins with age. Thread 2. During the day, that identical ripple activity can fire again in short windows of undirected wakeful rest, catching material the night shift may increasingly be missing. 2 systems, one mechanism running on 2 different clocks. Most people only know about the nighttime one because it's the one that comes with a bed and a bedtime and a word for it. The daytime one has no name most people have ever heard, no scheduled slot, and no cultural permission. Try explaining to a coworker that you're taking 10 minutes to stare at a wall on purpose. If you've ever driven a familiar route home and arrived with almost no memory of the drive itself, that gap wasn't your attention failing. It was your attention successfully doing something else, turning inward, letting replay run at the exact moment the outside world stopped demanding anything specific of you. If you've ever noticed that the detail of a conversation comes back to you clearly an hour later, walking somewhere alone with no phone out, that's not coincidence either. That's the librarian getting a window with nobody in the room. There's a well-known Harvard study worth bringing in here, though it gets used for a slightly different purpose than the one that matters most. In 2010, Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert used a foam-based sampling method to check in on thousands of people at random moments throughout their day, asking what they were doing and where their mind actually was. Nearly half the time, people's minds had wandered from whatever task was in front of them, and This is the part that usually gets quoted. People reported feeling less happy during those wandering moments, regardless of what the task itself was. That finding gets repeated as an argument for staying relentlessly focused every waking hour. It might be reading the data backwards. A wandering mind sampled at a random moment isn't necessarily an idle mind failing to enjoy the present. Some portion of that wandering is very plausibly the default mode network, doing exactly the filing work this video has been describing. And filing work interrupted by a buzzing phone mid-survey is not going to report itself as pleasant in the moment, even while it's doing something useful underneath. So which is it? Is mind wandering a mood problem to be corrected, or a maintenance process being mistaken for one? The honest answer is probably both, depending on what kind of wandering it is. Ruminating on an unresolved argument is not the same mental state as an unfocused half hour that quietly reorganizes yesterday's grocery run and a conversation from Tuesday. The Harvard data doesn't cleanly separate the two, and that's a real limitation worth naming rather than smoothing over. Now here's a number worth being careful with, because it gets repeated more confidently than it deserves. You may have seen the claim that a short rest period improves memory retention by up to 30%, cited constantly across wellness articles as if it's a single settled figure. That number traces back to a specific comparison in a specific small study, under specific conditions, rest versus a demanding distractor task, in patients with memory impairment, over a 10-minute window. It is a real result. It is not a universal multiplier that applies the same way to a healthy 30-year-old glancing at a memo. The mechanism is solid. The percentage got smoothed into a headline it was never built to support. Here's where this gets stranger than a simple memory tip. Because the same replay machinery that reshelves yesterday's grocery list also appears to be involved in something closer to identity than information. The hippocampus doesn't just store what happened, it stores what happened to you stitched into a rough timeline, which is part of why damage to it doesn't just erase facts. It can unstitch a person's sense of their own continuous story. Larry Squire and Eric Kandel's decades of work on patients with hippocampal damage, going back to the famous case of a patient known only as HM in the 1950s, showed something unsettling alongside the memory loss, a diminished sense of a personal future, as though the same structure that files away yesterday is also what lets you imagine tomorrow. This connects to something else that puzzles people about memory as they get older, and it has a real answer. Why does a wedding from 30 years ago stay sharp while a conversation from last Tuesday is already gone? A psychologist named James McClelland proposed an answer in the 1990s called systems consolidation, the idea that the hippocampus only holds a memory temporarily, as a kind of fast editable draft, before slowly transferring a more permanent copy into the cortex over months or years, the way a scratch file gets moved to permanent storage once it's been checked and confirmed. Worth keeping. A recent memory is still sitting in the hippocampus, dependent on exactly the replay process this video has been describing to get transferred at all. An old memory has usually already made the move, which is why it can survive even serious hippocampal damage later in life, while yesterday's conversation still sitting in the temporary folder cannot. The replay windows aren't just consolidating memory in general, they're the transfer mechanism itself. The only route a fast, fragile draft has toward becoming a durable, cortex-based copy that no single afternoon's interruption can undo. Which means those quiet minutes in the afternoon aren't only tidying facts. They may be part of how a continuous self gets assembled at all, one small compression cycle at a time, out of a day that would otherwise just be a pile of disconnected moments. You have never experienced your life as a smooth, continuous film. You've experienced it as a series of disconnected present moments, and something is doing the editing that makes it feel continuous afterward. It's fair to wonder how much of what you call yourself is actually a rough cut assembled hours or days later, in a room you never see, by an editor you've never met and can't observe directly. Some researchers in this space are candid that this raises more questions than the field can currently answer. Nobody has a clean account of exactly how much daytime replay contributes to identity formation versus straightforward fact retention. And anyone claiming certainty here is overstating the evidence. What's genuinely established is narrower, quiet, undirected, low stimulation rest reactivates hippocampal replay in the awake brain, using the same ripple mechanism documented in sleep. And it does this measurably even in people whose ordinary memory formation is severely impaired. It's worth being precise about one more distinction here, because this gets confused constantly. This is not an argument for napping. A nap that crosses into deeper sleep stages introduces its own cost, a groggy re-entry into wakefulness researchers call sleep inertia, which can leave a person performing worse for 20 to 30 minutes after waking than they did before they closed their eyes. The wakeful rest window described in Dewar's research kept people awake the entire time, eyes closed, undirected, but never crossing into actual sleep. That's a narrow and specific state, closer to what some contemplative traditions call quiet sitting than to anything resembling a nap. And it's precisely because it stays on the waking side of the line that it avoids the grogginess a nap risks. Consider a comparison from an entirely different field. A computer doesn't save a large file the instant you finish typing it. It buffers changes in working memory and writes them to permanent storage in batches, often during idle cycles when the processor isn't being asked to do anything else. If you yank the power cord during one of those idle write cycles, you lose whatever hadn't been committed yet. Your afternoon may be functioning as exactly that kind of idle write cycle, and every notification is functionally yanking the cord mid-save. The file isn't corrupted, it's just perpetually unsaved, waiting for an idle window long enough to finish. Read that again. Every notification is functionally yanking the cord mid-save. 30 years of forming a full night's memories, a full afternoon of forming today's, cut short, over and over, by a habit that feels completely harmless in the moment it happens. There's a recognition most people have felt and never once connected to any of this. The unsettled, slightly foggy feeling at the end of a day spent constantly switching between tasks. Never one thing wrong, just a vague sense that the day didn't land anywhere. That's not tiredness in the ordinary sense. That may be a day's worth of replay windows that never got the chance to open. A librarian who never once got the room to herself. I'd bet a fair number of people listening to this have felt exactly that fog, and blamed it on sleep the night before, when the actual gap might have opened up 8 hours earlier, at 2 in the afternoon, at a desk between one meeting and the next. I'm genuinely curious whether that lines up with your experience or not. There's an honest disagreement worth naming here, too. Some cognitive scientists argue that what looks like beneficial rest in these studies is really just the absence of a competing task, and that any sufficiently boring activity, folding laundry waiting in a line, would produce a similar benefit, not stillness itself. Others insist the eyes closed, low sensory input condition specifically is what matters, because visual processing alone consumes a significant share of the very cortical resources replay depends on. The honest answer is that the field hasn't fully settled which explanation carries more weight, and both camps can point to real data. There's a useful model for this from geology rather than computing. Sediment settling at the bottom of a lake doesn't form clean, readable layers if the water above it is constantly disturbed. A current running through, silt getting kicked up and resettled before it can compact. Undisturbed water lets each season's layers settle and lock in place, which is exactly how geologists read a lakebed core like a calendar, one band per year, clean and legible going back centuries. Stirred water produces a smeared, unreadable core, where years of material exist, but nothing in it can be dated or separated out. A day with no undisturbed stretch in it produces something similar. The experience has happened. They're in there somewhere. But nothing about the record is clean enough to read back clearly, because the water never once sat still long enough to let anything settle. What nobody disputes is the shape of the trade-off. A day built entirely around continuous input, switching from task to notification to task, is a day where the librarian never gets the room. A life built that way for years doesn't produce a dramatic collapse. It produces a slow accumulation of afternoons that technically happened and were never quite filed anywhere retrievable. Experienced, then lost somewhere between the moment they occurred and the moment they would have been consolidated, because that moment kept arriving and kept getting interrupted before it could finish. And here's where the two threads actually converge, rather than just running side by side. If the nighttime replay system is thinning with age, and the daytime replay system depends on a kind of stillness that has become one of the rarest states in a modern day, then the two aren't separate problems stacking on top of each other. They're the same shortage showing up on two different clocks, one clock running slower than it used to, the other clock barely getting wound at all. Fixing only one of them, sleeping more while still checking a phone every 11 minutes all day, addresses maybe half of what's actually going on. This isn't a call to add a task to your day. This is a channel that isn't going to hand you a routine, a number of minutes, or a step-by-step drill, and that's deliberate. The moment stillness becomes another obligation with a target attached. It stops being the thing that was working. The instant something has a goal, the prefrontal cortex, the supervisor, steps back into the room to manage progress toward that goal, and the whole mechanism this script has been describing depends on the supervisor staying out. There's one more piece worth naming because it answers a question this whole video has been building toward. Without stating it outright, how does the editor decide what's worth keeping out of everything that happened in a single afternoon? A structure called the amygdala, sitting right next to the hippocampus, tags moments with emotional weight as they happen, not consciously, not something you feel as a tag being applied, and replay appears to prioritize exactly those tagged moments during both sleep and wakeful rest, running them more often and more intensely than neutral ones. That's why an argument from years ago can resurface in sharper detail than what you had for lunch 3 days ago. The editor isn't neutral. It has a bias built into the hardware, and the bias runs toward whatever mattered emotionally at the time, whether or not that's what you'd choose to keep if you were doing the choosing yourself. If any part of this reframed something you'd never questioned before, and there's a stranger layer of this still coming, about what the self actually is if it's assembled after the fact rather than lived in real time. Subscribe now, because that's the part of this channel worth being here for. Here's something worth sitting with rather than acting on. You have never once experienced the version of yourself that exists after editing. You've only ever experienced the raw footage moment to moment, while something else, quietly, without your permission or your awareness, in gaps you don't choose and mostly don't notice, assembles the cut you'll eventually call your memory of today. The person reviewing that footage tonight or tomorrow afternoon, in another quiet 10 minutes, is not exactly the same person who lived it. It's an editor working from a script it wrote itself, out of moments it selected for reasons you were never shown. If this was useful in a way you didn't expect, hit like. It's a strange thing to say about a video with no protocol in it, but the signal still tells the algorithm to put this in front of somebody else, the exact idea nobody had explained to them properly. Tell me in the comments, can you remember in real detail what you did yesterday afternoon between 2 and 4? Not the headline of it, the texture. If you can't, that gap is the whole subject of this video. Share this with someone who says they can't remember anything anymore and assumes it's just their age. It might not be their memory failing. It might be that the room never once got empty. There's a strange asymmetry worth sitting with before this ends. You will never get to compare the edited version of today against the raw footage because the raw footage was never saved anywhere you can access it. There is no original file to check the copy against. Whatever the editor produces, tonight or tomorrow afternoon, is the only version that will ever exist. Not a summary of something more real sitting in a vault somewhere, but the actual final cut, with no director's commentary and no deleted scenes. That should probably unsettle you slightly. It unsettles me, and I've spent a long time with this material, reading studies where the same patients, over and over, could hold nothing new for more than a few seconds unless the room around them fell quiet at exactly the right moment. A reminder that whatever is doing this filing work isn't a metaphor for something else happening in the brain. It is the actual mechanism running right now, whether or not anyone in the room happens to notice. So the next time an afternoon goes quiet and there's nothing obvious to fill it with, consider not filling it. Something in you has been waiting all day for exactly that kind of nothing. You've never once touched yesterday directly. You've only ever touched what got filed in a room you weren't invited into by whoever it is that does the filing.